Hello and welcome to Class 3 of the Dewey Decimal Classification. In this session, we'll be building on what we've talked about previously, as well as looking at the standard subdivisions. So the topics that I cover in the class are meant to support your exploration and work within the schedules. So the class sessions will cover a lot of the terminology as well as um, looking at the structure and sort of building those resources that you need to help support your work within the schedules and within the manual itself. So on that note, we'll just dive right in. Of course, we have our weekly discussion every week, and then we have your work with the schedules, so what you're doing with the schedules in terms of exercises and assignments, and then we won't have any other read and reacts or anything like that. It's really just the first session as far as that goes. So for the next 2 weeks, you will be focused on working with the schedules and increasing your expertise and knowledge in terms of notation building. So we've looked at this wonderful little graphic a little bit more and a little bit in the past. This is sort of a very just sort of nice graphic of the main classes of the Dewey Decimal System. It is meant to be a world of knowledge, as we've discussed previously, and our part of it is really figuring out how those things fit into that world of knowledge. So, how do we go about that process? Well, if you already have a record in place, if you are cataloging from a record, if you are starting to do your classification work, you're doing your classifying from a record that exists already, then you have a little bit of help because if the record already exists, then there's a subject heading there, and you can use that as a starting point in um, your investigation process in terms of your figuring out how you're going to classify this item. Of course, there's other ways of doing it too. Um, if you have a particular collection in your library, you may choose to emphasize a different part of it, but in terms of how those subject headings work with our call numbers, that's typically where we're going to start. So consider the subject headings, consider their order. The first subject heading is considered to be the primary subject heading. Other things that you may look at is when you're looking at subject headings, especially if you're looking at Library of Congress subject headings, they may have form subject headings on them, like guidebooks or periodicals or something like that. So that can help you determine your facets. So when you're looking at an OCLC record, look at all of the subject headings and especially all those different subdivisions, because those subdivisions can help you in determining what subdivisions you should use in notation or what facets you should cover in notation. Of course, you're going to want to select the appropriate discipline. So, where does it fit in Dewey? So taking that subject heading and looking to see where it fits in Dewey. And then, of course, you're going to want to look to see what is the most specific you can get. So how close can you get to actually matching exactly that subject heading to a particular a particular number in Dewey. And then, of course, adding to that number you can use the build features if that's appropriate, but really do consider those facets. So, of course, no one class can cover all aspects of a subject. And we know sometimes that when we're looking at subject headings or we're looking at a particular work, it may seem that topics are sort of even in that work. So it's like, well, it's about these 2 things or these 4 things or however many things may be covered, and they're sort of equal in terms of that coverage. And we also know that sometimes, so that can be a little bit of a challenge, like which one do you choose? And I would say in that case, you have a little bit more discretion if your item is about several different topics, but you might just look to see if you do already have a subject heading, which one is the first. That may help you. But of course, we also know that there are things that, there's so many different aspects of a topic, especially when you're looking at these sort of broad topics. And so, figuring out where it actually fits in the class and how those things can fit together can be a little bit of a challenge. And so for many subjects, those different aspects can be located in different classes. And so the relative index, if you've not taken a chance to look at that, or if you've not done some searching in the relative index, if you use WebDewey, the searching in the relative index is very, very helpful. But this can bring together all those different aspects of a topic and those different classes where they're found. So that gives you a good example of like seeing how something can be broken apart across all of these different classes. So a couple of examples, if you've not actually done these are good examples to do. You might try looking in the relative index for clothing, or you might look in the relative index for something like oats. So pick something that's very general that will go across multiple disciplines, and you will then kind of get a better sense of how the relative index can help you. So if you had a book on clothing and you were trying to figure out, like, where might it fit? Which part of Dewey could it fit in? Then the relative index can really help you. Is this more fashion related? Is it more related to manufacturing and textiles? Is it design? Um, you know, is it something about the fibers? Where does it fit in terms of that? So the relative index, you can just do a basic search. You can also browse and get to the relative index that way. But we're just going to look quickly at clothing. And, here we get some examples of some things uh, that are related to clothing. Now, when you see that little puzzle piece, the little puzzle piece means that that is a built number. And so if you were going to classify something that was about the commerce or selling of fur clothing, then that's the base notation you would start with. So that's kind of where you would start. You might not need to really add anything else to it, or if there was a facet, let's say you had, it was about a particular location, then you might want to add that piece in. But that's sort of your built number to get started when you have those. We have down here, you see that little like a bookmark that tells you it's in the manual. So if you see that little sort of book with a bookmark in it, that tells you that that is a citation to the manual. So built numbers will tell you, will really help you give you a little bit more information and kind of get you started in a direction. And built numbers appear because people have contributed, and we'll talk a tiny bit about contributing towards the end, but they are contributing those numbers to DDC, and so that's how you see those numbers appear. There will be notes and other informations that will tell you about how to use those numbers, a little bit more information about them sometimes. Built numbers are usually listed for two reasons. They're to provide that entry point, as I already talked about, or they're to provide an entry for a three-digit built number. And we'll look at some examples of that as we kind of go along in the next couple of weeks. So the next couple of weeks, we'll be looking at a little bit more examples, but we'll still be covering some of the vocabulary and terminology as we go along. Interdisciplinary numbers, you've already seen an example of that. That is a number used for works covering a subject from the perspective of more than one discipline. It's often identified by a class here, interdisciplinary note. So this is when you have something that's going to it's going to be kind of a broad topic. So if you had something that was just about clothing in general, it's not really about any particular topic in clothing, then that may be where you would see that sort of that number. So for example, the interdisciplinary number for clothing is 391. And so that's just when you have something that's just a broad book about clothing. It's not about design. It's not about textiles. it's not about sizing or whatever it may be, some other aspect of clothing or manufacturing of clothing. It's just sort of about clothing in general. So you might see more interdisciplinary numbers used for juvenile material, sort of those, you know, um, just like introduction to clothing and, that kind of all about clothing, those kinds of sort of general topical things that we sometimes see, especially um, with children's materials. It's sort of just informational material at a most general level. So, one of the things to think about when you're thinking about whether or not you should use one of these numbers is, um, does your item really fit into that category? And of course, the first thing you're going to decide is there a more specific topic? And if there is, then you're going to look to see where that specific topic fits. But the other thing to think about is to really consider whether or not the work contains a significant material on the discipline. So is it, it really contains um, that sort of broad overview of clothing. If not, then you're going to want to figure out where your item needs to go. We've talked about facets a little bit in the past, but I just want to kind of uh, remind you and refresh sort of thinking about facets, because facets are something that is going to be an important part of that notation system. So, thinking about when you are thinking about doing a notation, you really are going to consider these things. Does your subject, in addition to whatever topic it may have, does it also talk about kinds of social problems? Does it talk about categories of persons affected? So it talks about people. Does it talk about a location? Does it talk about a time period? So, we talked a little bit sort of about those general facets. So thinking about it in terms of a subject area of social welfare. So if you think about those facets that we've talked about in the past, those sort of general buckets of facets, applying those to social welfare, the same sort of things. What kind of thing is it? What people are affected? Is there a location? Is there a time period? And then those basic principles and ideas. So, this is one of the things that as you go forward in your classifying, in fact, this is just a great little example to even clip out as, you know, um, an example to have I covered all of these things? And looking at my notation, have I looked for a look to see if it is related to a location, a time period, sort of these basic principles? Are there any people that are involved or impacted by this? And then of course, a little bit more about the kind, or is there any kind of topical subdivision for it? So we're just going to kind of skim through talking about our tables today. And then as you are working through your exercise for this week, you will be spending much more time with the tables, with the manual, with Web Dewey and the schedules as a whole. So there is no part of, if you're using print, there's no part of the print DDC that is off limits. So you may be consulting the manual, you may be looking in the relative index, you may be looking at the summaries. You're definitely going to be reading the schedules and the notes and working with that. So, and all those tables that are available to you. So you will be looking at all parts of it. If you're using WebDewey, in a way, it's a little bit easier in that way because you have access to all of it within WebDewey. But again, you're going to be looking in all parts of DDC and consulting all parts of it, just as you would when you're doing your daily work. So table 1 is standard subdivisions, and this is really kind of gets to a lot of when you're looking at a record in OCLC and you have that topical subject heading that's there, and so you maybe have something like cooking or whatever it may be, and then you have another subdivision that goes after it. A lot of these will be covered in this standard subdivision aspect, but they are not exactly a one-to-one relationship. So we have some form things here, we have some subject things, so there's a little bit that the topics are not going to be a one-to-one match to what you would see when you're looking in the um, looking at the subject headings that are in the existing record. But you're just going to kind of look through your list, and really, when you are starting your notation with your base call number, you're going to look to see if standard subdivisions apply, and most of the time they do. And then you're going to look to see if any of these subdivisions apply to your particular notation. Again, we've got a form here. So is it a dictionary, encyclopedia, any of that kind of stuff? Is it a periodical or serial publication? Does it have to do with organization management principles, education research, statistical? So you're just going to kind of look through this list to see what might be applicable to you. So if you're doing the build process, you're going to figure out what your base notation is, going as granular as you can, and then from there you'll use that start function to do that build process, and then look to see what else you need to add. So sort of working this out on paper first, what is my notation, figuring out what your notation is, and then figuring out all the particular facets of that item that you have in your hands, or that can even be a digital object that you're doing. It doesn't really matter what that kind of format is for this particular thing, but what facets do I need to cover? And then once you kind of have that little checklist of these are the facets that I could cover or that I may be covering, and then here's my base notation, then you can start with your base notation and kind of work through to see what you need to cover. So standard subdivisions, you'll spend quite a bit of time in, and then some of the other subdivisions and other tables you'll spend time in depending upon what kind of materials it is. Standard subdivisions apply to just about everything in DDC. So this is just a list, but it's a pretty good list to kind of just kind of work from in terms of, if you have a serial, if you have a textbook, do you have educational principles, equipment used, government documents, school curriculum, any of these kind of things, these would be things that would fall under that standard subdivisions. So the standard subdivisions, they can really kind of help you they'll also direct you. If you're in WebDewey especially, they'll also sometimes direct you to other things. So there's the special tables too, which talks about areas. So it talks about geographic places and things like that. And then 5 talks about groups. So it may direct you over to other places. So that's one of the things to be very aware of when you're using the standard subdivisions in the table 1, is that they will sometimes direct you other places. And that's really true for all the tables. You want to follow your notations and your notes very carefully. If it tells you to look someplace, or if it refers you to another number, if it gives you a link to something else, then you need to go read that and look at it and see if it applies to your particular situation, because it probably does. Of course, we've talked about the zeros a little bit in terms of why, how the zero works a little bit. The zero has a lot of different ways that it works in zeros, but within the Table 1 standard subdivision, the 0 actually says that this is a transition from a main subject to a secondary subject. So that 0 actually does have meaning. And it does the kinds of subdivisions actually, we have sort of a lot of different relationships that are kind of implied with that. So it could be, what parts to the whole, or kinds to the whole, branches to the whole, principles and ideas that apply equally, and then all of those kind of, all of the different kinds of aspects. I won't read through all of the slides, but I do want to give you as much information as I can in terms of how you apply things. if you're using a table 1 number, then you're not going to use that unless you have specific instructions. So you will have special instructions for most things that will at least point you to that and say, like, you can use this subdivision, or here's how you use this subdivision, things like that. There is a table of precedence, so if you have more than 2 numbers that apply, then you want to look at that, and that's available in both Web Dewey and the print. You do use at least the 1 0. For most of the exercises in this class, you're not going to have to add in a bunch of zeros to keep them from conflicting with another 0, but that is an important thing to know, that you can add those zeros in if needed to keep from conflicting with another usage. So that's something to just remember, that as you are building your notations, you also want to check to make sure you're not creating a duplicate in a conflict. We've already talked about the rule of 0, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot more talking about the rule of 0. It's just one of those things, you just follow the instructions and just follow your notations, follow your instructions, and build that way. Some examples of standard subdivisions. We're going to kind of talk about some examples and look through some things. Standard subdivisions are not always in the same position across all the classes, but it isn't, so that's why it's really important to look at the summaries and at the beginning of the class where you're working. So you remember when I said you really need to read all your hierarchies and read all of the information, go all the way up that hierarchy to that main class, read all of those notes, because there is something called a forced hierarchy where the note that's at the top applies down. So you do want to make sure to read everything associated all the way up your hierarchy to make sure you're not missing something. Here's an example, 355. It shows the summary of the class and where the standard subdivisions lie. And if you go a little bit further, you may not necessarily see that information. 540 standard subdivisions come at 540.1 -9. So those can be someplace, they're not always logical. There is a movement to standardize how Dewey is sort of structured. So we may see some of these things where, this notion of you have to always read essentially all the way up the hierarchy, go all the way up the hierarchy from where you're starting your base notation and make sure that you've not missed anything. And at some point we may see more standardization where it's not, you don't have to actually check each and every level as you go up, but for now you do. We have an example of military history, and that is 355.003, and it falls within the range of 001 to -09. That's in the summary. 03 represents encyclopedias, and that's taken from table 1. But we can't just attach that 03 to 355 to get the 355.03, because the range of 0.02 to 0.07 is reserved for basic considerations for military science. And that's all, oops, I missed a word there, but that's all in the summary there. So therefore you have to actually add to it to make it go over 1. Chemistry education at the secondary education level, that is 540.712, and that falls within the range as indicated in the summary. So again, that's the same sort of thing where you need to read your summaries carefully. More than one standard subdivision can be indicated. So you have a periodical on research and theory and meteorology. So there we have two topics. It's research and theory, and of course then we have a periodical, so we have a facet. So when you have a periodical, you're going to start with your subject typically first. So our subject is meteorology. So that's 551.5. And then we have of course, then we have research and theory. So then we have some subjects. And then we have a periodical. So we have our form. So periodical serial publications fall at 05, and then research falls within 07, and then theory falls within 01. So this is where we would look at our table of precedence to see which one would we use first. So would we start with 05, 07, or 01? So periodical versus research. If we look at those two, the 07 comes first in the table of preference. So we would choose research over periodical. And then research versus theory. Research comes first, so we would use research first. Now, you may think, well, but we want all of our periodicals that are meteorology. We're a big library, we're a big science library, we're a big weather library. We want all of our periodicals to kind of sit together, as opposed to have them kind of split between periodicals, research, and then periodicals. We want them to have periodicals first. So this is one of those areas where, you may make a decision based upon how you actually want to group things, because of course as we get to these very granular sort of notations, then that is actually grouping things on a shelf differently. So if you wanted to, although that the preference would be that you're going to follow the table and you're going to choose research as your subdivision over theory or over periodical. If you actually wanted to group your periodicals together, then you might choose periodical first and then follow the rest of this. So there are times when we do tweak things and make decisions differently so that we can get things to sit on the shelf the way they need to for a particular topic. So, and of course, if we even looking at the research aspect of it, we're not just going to go with 07 as research, because that represents education, research, and related topics. So we actually need to define it further, because that's a more broad topic. So we have just research in terms of that. So we need to look a little bit deeper and define that research is 07 too. So if we follow the table of precedence and we follow the order, then we would choose 07 because that comes first. And of course, then choosing 07, then we would actually need to define it, be the most specific you can. So in this case, we can go down to 072. So that would be what we would use for our subdivision or meteorology, which will give us 551.5072. So that's how we would get to that number. Now again, if we wanted to group all of our science, our meteorology periodicals together, then we might choose to go periodical first and then choose the other instead. So we talked a little bit about general areas of places. So this is where you're going to look if you have a geographic subdivision or if you have something about a place or location. These are typically divided into general, which would be the 1, and then more specific would be 3 and onward. Specific places are further subdivided, so you're really just going to look you're just going to spend some time with this one, especially next week in the exercises, to really look at those geographic places. Remember, you're going to go as granular and specific as you can. So follow the tables, follow the schedules. If you have something that is related to, let's say, North Carolina, then you're going to look under modern places, but then you're going to look under North America. And then, of course, you're going to look under United States, because there's other places in North America besides the United States, and then you're going to actually go down to the state level for North Carolina. So, if you have a particular country, you're going to go down all the way to that country level. So if you have, um, something related to Ireland, you're not just going to choose Europe. You're going to actually go down to the Ireland level. And, thinking about sort of the EU, as the EU changes, that may change how things are organized at some point in the future. So as countries shift, they may change where they are located. So how do you use Table 2 for areas? Well, it can always be added to a Table 1 number where there's a designation. And especially you're going to see this in the '09 category. Uh, Sometimes, so this is again, you're going to follow your instructions. Sometimes Dewey gives instructions to add Table 2 area numbers directly to a class without anything in the middle. You're just going to follow what you need to follow the instructions in Dewey. So just follow the instructions, what it tells you to do. Table 3, this is really where you're going to spend time for individual literatures and specific literary works and specific literary forms. So this is where you're going to, this is going to be another one you're going to spend time with next week. So, this is where you're really looking, if you're going to put something in the 700s or 800s, this is going to be one of your go-to tables. So if you're working in the 700s or 800s, this is going to be a table that you're going to spend time with. Table 3A, this is for works by and about individual authors. So this would be where your biographies would go. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied this morning. Table 3B, this is works by or about more than one author. So this is where you'd put those anthologies, collected works, things like that. And then 3C is a little bit, this is one of those that's a little bit odd, but it's subdivisions indicating specific qualities, themes, etc., especially if anthologies and critical treatments of literary periods. So if you have something that's like 18th century something, then this one might be a table that you would look at. So I would say, again, start with your base number and then work your way through the tables as you need to. But if you're working in the 700s or 800s, this is going to be one of the ones that you're going to look at. Table 3C, when attached to literary numbers, are attached only to Table 3B numbers, which of course are in turn attached to a literature base. So if you have 3C, then you should have a 3B first. So if you're going to use 3C, you should have a 3B. Like that makes sense. And then Table 4, this is where you're going to spend time if you have language-related material. And the subdivision, this table of subdivision is attached only to base numbers in the 400s. And that is the Dewey section on individual languages. So these two are actually in some ways pretty easy to know when you would apply them. For Table 3, you're going to apply them for only the 800s and 700s. Table 4 is going to be for the 400s. And this one is a subdivision. These subdivisions are a mixture of, basic things related to language study. So phonetics, etymology, language dictionaries, grammar, standard usage, things like that. Linguistics related to a particular language are classed with that particular language. And so the formula is the language base plus the subdivision from this table. So this is one of these things you should be getting familiar with, at least in your head, is thinking about what your formula is. Your formula is always going to be your base notation, and then your subdivisions, figuring out what your facets are, that kind of thing. Table 5, this is where we get to groups of people. And it's a list of groups of people, sometimes by using add devices combined with the geographical numbers from Table 2. This is applied all over Dewey, so you can kind of use it across just about any subject. Numbers of this table can be attached to 089 in Table 2 to specify where any topic is limited to the consideration of a particular ethnic or national group. Dewey does not have provisions for classifying informational objects by their language. And so that's one of those areas where you're going to have to cover that for in your descriptive cataloging or in your subject headings. So this is one of those areas where in the subject heading, if you have this sort of topic where it is a book about something in a particular language, you're going to have to cover that in your subject headings. There won't really be a way to get to that in the Dewey notation. General 6 is simply a list of languages of people on Earth. Uh, if you look carefully, though, you'll find that many languages are grouped with other similar languages, and some do not have their own specific notations. This again is used throughout the system. It's mostly used in the 400s to derive those language numbers. So, you're going to look at something from the table from the 400s plus a number from the table 6. Table 5 is an add-on to the 089 category of Table 1, and theoretically it can be added to any number in the system. However, to do so, the topic has to be limited in scope to the meaning of this table. And then Table 6 is only to be used where instructed. So basically, as you're going through, remember, as you get your base notation, then you figure out what your facets are, and that could be topical, so it could be things like history, it could be things, all of those facets we looked at. Is it about people? Is it about some other aspect of the topic? And you go as granular as you can with your base notation. Once you get as granular as you can, then you look to your subdivisions, and you're just actually going to go through all of the tables to see what applies to you. Now, as you become more versed in Dewey and you have areas that you've been classifying a bit, then you will probably know exactly when you can use Table 6, because you'll know you'll be working with languages. They'll be mostly in the 400s. You'll know when you're going to be working with Table 5, because that's when you're working with people, anything about people, or if you're working with individual languages and language families, you're also going to be looking at Table 4. And then if you're working with literature, which is the 800s and a few places in the 700s, you're going to be looking at Table 3. Table 1 is for most general everything else. And then Table 2 is places. So Table 1 is kind of general, all kinds of things, including forms like periodicals, things like textbooks, things like that. Table 2 is places, geographic areas. Table 3 is related to arts and literature. Table 4 is related to individual language and language families. Table 5 is people. Table 6 is more on languages. And then 5 and 6 are those two tables where 5 relates to Table 1. So if you're using Table 5, that means you've been probably referred there from that Table 1. And then Table 6 is only when instructed for use, so it's not used very often. There are in-text tables throughout Dewey, and so you've probably already discovered these already. One example for this kind of thing is if you look at 362 to 363, that's a centered heading. Remember, centered heading is a range. So if you look there, you'll find that kind of built-in table. If you also look in the medicine areas, you'll find those. And they are applied to the base numbers in specific sections of the table. So in a way, they function a little bit like the other tables, but their application is usually very limited. So you'll find these little mini tables kind of throughout Dewey that kind of tell you what you're looking at. There are tables that are extracted from the schedule text, and Dewey will kind of put these in places in the schedules, but they don't enumerate them as distinct tables. And you'll see them often in the form of instructions. So I'll say add to the base number and it'll tell you, add to the whatever your base number is, the numbers, and it'll tell you the digits, and then following, and it'll give you that kind of instruction. So for an example, if you look in the schedule for 523, you'll see that kind of thing, or if you look throughout 636, you'll see that. These tables are identified as list of regular numbers in the DDC schedules and this is really from where you'll you just follow the instructions. So if it tells you to add to your base number these digits following a particular example, you're going to follow those instructions. Here's an example of that. So we have add to the base number 551.5772, the notation 1 through 9 from table 2. So in other words, table 2, you remember, is places. So we are trying to get to rainfall in Nigeria. So we need to add that, add to our base call number something to Nigeria. So it actually tells you, as an example, that you can do that. Here's another example here, down here in the snowfall. It gives you, variations in snowfall and snow and snowfall over time. It gives you that example too. Add to base number, and then it tells you the following numbers that you're going to add when you want to cover those topics. Example of the building process. You can use the building processes in Dewey, or you can use whatever building process you want to do. You can use scratch paper and the schedules and work out there. You can go top to bottom. You can start most general at your class and work your main class and work your way down. You can start as granular as you can and work in either direction that you need to work in. But for an example, we're going to use WebDewey to look at a cartoon guide to short-haired cats. One way to do it is to do this very hierarchy process and to start through the main classes and drill down until you can go no further. That's one way of doing it. And a lot of people like to kind of go that process. And another way is to check the relative index. So you can check there and kind of see, look for short-haired cats, kind of see where you're going to go. That may be another way to go. And you can also in WebDewey, of course, do some basic searching to see where you can go. And, kind of depends upon really how you want to do things. So if you look in WebDewey and you just look for cats, we have up here 636.8. That would be a place that would be an easy place to kind of jump in and start and kind of go more granular there. But we also see here that we have 636.82 for short-haired cats. And that seems like that's actually probably the best place to start. Now, of course, we do have a number here for short-haired cats humorous treatment. So that might be something that we'd want to look at too, and also to look at our material closely. If we have a cartoon guide to short-haired cats, is it a humorous? And if it is, then we already have the built number right there. And so that may be all we have for our Dewey number. We may not really have much more we're going to add to it. We may have nothing else to add to it. That just may be our number. So if we had, if it was a periodical, if it was a serial, a magazine, short-haired cats, a cartoon magazine that came out every week or month or whatever, then at that point we might add to this. We might add our serial notation, but this call number might just stand as it is. Now, if we had other titles that had the same exact call number, then we would want to figure out how we're going to separate those out so we don't have the same exact call number for different works on the shelf. But we're going to just kind of start at the top there. So we just started out, we could kind of start at the top and kind of look to see whether or not that seems like it fits. And then we can go back up our hierarchy and actually look all the way through and make sure this is where our particular item fits. This one is a pretty easy one because there was already a built number for it, but it is something we'd want to just investigate a little bit in terms of what the formula is. this is a good way to learn too, just to kind of look things up and then look at the formula. So we have short-haired cats, 636.82, and then it comes from, so plus, so adding to that base call number, 636.82, that base notation, from table 1, we're going to add 0207. 0207, and that is for humorous treatment. So if we click over there and we actually look at it, we will see in table 1, that's where humorous treatment falls. So that's kind of a good way to also see how things are put together. If you just search topics, any topic you can think of, or if you have some records you're looking at in OCLC, you can just search those subject headings, see what you can find. And then when you find those call numbers, especially for a base call number, look to see how it's actually been put together. So we've already talked about this in terms of looking at the example, but we can check up and down our hierarchy to make sure we don't really have a way, we don't have anything else with this. It's just a cartoon guide on short-haired cats, so there's really not anything else we can include in terms of our facets. So it looks like we've got a good choice. So that would be our call number there. We don't have anything that conflicts with it on our shelf, so we've done our work. We can say that base call number will stand. We can add that in to our record and then print our label, and we're done with that. If we actually go and look to see what this looks like, we will see that in that table 1, it's in the miscellaneous category, and there it is right there, that humorous treatment. So that can be not only a good tool in terms of looking to see how things are put together, but as you're working through things, that can be the, be thinking about that process, the base notation, plus plus your facets, plus the other aspects, other topics related to your item. So, in terms of how to do this we've talked about this whole example a couple of times. In terms of this, actually does include how do you build the number in WebDewey. So the mechanical process with it. So find your starting number, with the added instructions, figure out where you're going to start, and then you're going to click start and add, of course, going the most granular you can, and then you're going to work your way through the system, whether or not you need to add facets, and then whether or not the user terms that appear, whether or not they need to be changed, and all that kind of stuff. One of the nice things you can do in WebDewey is you can save as an institutional personal visibility. So you can save call numbers for yourself, which don't necessarily have to go out to everybody else. And you can also contribute to the Dewey editors if you want to. You can also save these institutionally. So, you could save them so you can share them with others in yours. And with the WebDewey building tool, you're going to start with the base number, as you always do. Then you're going to look to see if you can add standard subdivisions, and then you're going to add, or any other subdivisions you might need to add. It's not just the standard ones, but any subdivisions you might need to have to cover those facets, cover those additional topics. Then you're going to add your user terms, and they give you a choice from those. And then you're going to save it for institutional personal use or contribute it to the Dewey editors. So in terms of how that looks, we have short-haired cats. We click on start because short-haired cats is as close as we can get. We've already reviewed it to make sure that's an appropriate choice. And then we get our notes. As always, you're going to read the notes carefully, consider them carefully. We're not going to read all of these notes. You can follow along and do this on your own time and read all those notes, but they actually tell you, like if you're going to use the where to insert the decimal point, and then also what to do with your zeros too, that you're going to drop the terminal zeros before any a standard subdivision, and then they give you some examples of that. So there's lots. This is really your instructions for how to apply these things. So we have humorous treatment. So we're going to click add. So we just click on that, and then click on the add button there. You see here we have all these notes. You can see the manual up here in terms of whether or not you're going to use a particular category. So if you're a little bit not sure, like oh, I don't know, do I use 0207 or should I look in table 3? I don't know. You can just click on any of these and go read those and then come back to this. So it's a very useful process in terms of that. So we have we've chosen our humorous treatment, which is in table 1, and then we just click on add, and then that adds it together. It builds our call number, and then it puts gives us that formula down there so we can see what that formula is. And then at this point we can save it and we can do the other parts of it. Again, you have a lot of opportunities to review and see your facets, see what are your facets. If this was about an organization, then I would an organization of people who like short hair cats, then I would need to kind of re-examine what I was doing in terms of how I was going. But you can easily jump around within WebDewey. And you can identify those user terms. So, what kind of short hair cat is it? Well, this is just short hair cats. It's not anyone in particular. And then once you do that, then you can, at this point, you can save personal or institutional use or contribute. If you contribute, then it goes out to that bigger Dewey group. So that's sort of how all of that part of it works. The nice thing about using the WebDewey tool is it does display the progress that you're making, and kind of records that progress. It adds, I think it's really easy to see the notes that you might need to follow, and it's really helpful in terms of directing where you need to go. You can go off and search for something and come back to where you were. I have been told that sometimes it does not always work correctly, so you do want to make sure that when you are clicking on a table that you apply the right you make sure that you're getting the right application. So you need to make sure that you read your notes carefully, because while it works very well most of the time, especially when you get very granular or you get to the literature areas or some of these other areas where you may be combining facets or combining tables, you just want to make sure that you're following the instructions, because if you follow the instructions, then you will make sure that uh, it is building the numbers it needs to be and it didn't skip anything. It should do that work, but sometimes it will skip things. On that note, follow the hierarchy. Follow the hierarchy. Be specific. Go as specific as possible. Check the tables always. It's okay to look in OCLC to help you get a base call number. Classify is another resource that can help you get a base call number, but you're going to still want to check to make sure that's accurate. Be unique, so don't create multiple call numbers that are the same for different works. And just follow your hierarchy, follow your notes, follow your schedule. Spend some time with Dewey. Of course, as you become more familiar with the different parts of Dewey and you become more familiar with WebDewey, it gets easier and easier, but you always want to follow what is in Dewey, because things change, and that's the other piece of it too, is that you can make little cheat sheets and things like that, but you always want to check to make sure that you're using the most current notation that's been established for a particular topic. And on that note, thank you and have a great